Hello and welcome to App Dev Platforms for Kubernetes. I'm your host today, Mike Vizard, and we'll be talking about all things related to developing modern applications on one of the more complex platforms ever to come down the proverbial pike these days. We will be giving away 4 Amazon gift cards today, so I encourage you to stay to the very end to see who's going to win those. I also am asking you all to participate a little bit with us. We have a Q&A button in there where you guys can be part of our discussion. Feel free to ask any question you like, and we'll either answer you directly or I'll read it out to folks for a bigger, larger discussion as we go along. Our panelists today are Samantha Wang, who is a product manager for Influx Data. They make a database that is widely used to drive observability platforms in real time so we can get those kinds of queries going. And as we all know, we're shifting left, so that's becoming a bigger deal. Our other panelist is Robert Brennan, who's Director of Open Source for Fairwinds, best known as a provider of managed services around Kubernetes and a few other open source platforms. And they also are contributors to, last time I counted, maybe 5 different open source projects that you guys have launched. So they are players in the space, as we say. Let's get into it. I'm a little perplexed about the whole state of app dev on Kubernetes. I've been following the space for some time. People have been talking about platform as a service. They've been talking about container as a service. There's all kinds of desktop tools. And yet when it comes to Kubernetes, there's just a lot of people who feel that maybe it's too complex and they don't really like to use Kubernetes, and there's a lot of resistance, shall we say. So Robert, what's your sense of where are we on the maturity of Kubernetes for application developers, and how far down the path are we, and what is the big hurdle?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say Kubernetes was really designed to solve problems for ops folks rather than developers, right? It was meant to solve problems around scaling, around consistency, around being able to reproduce your deployments really neatly, roll back really easily. It doesn't really solve problems that developers experience on a day-to-day basis, as they change code, make pull requests, things like that. So I think that's part of the problem that we're seeing, is that Kubernetes was adopted on the ops side of the house, and now developers are realizing they have to learn more and more about Kubernetes in order to be successful. And so you're seeing a lot of platforms and open source technologies get kind of tacked on and layered onto the stack to kind of help developers with that transition. And we've seen some great attempts at that, but it's a very complex platform. It does a lot of things, and I think a lot of developers don't really want to have all that context, especially as they're developing on a day-to-day basis. They don't necessarily want to have to think about all the nitty-gritty details of how their application actually runs on a host machine. They kind of just want to run it locally on their server, push the code, and then hope somebody else takes it over the goal line and gets it actually behind a production URL and serving traffic to real users. But the whole shift to DevOps is really supposed to start putting more and more of that context on the developer's plate. So they have to think about, how does my application scale? What is the memory and CPU footprint like, et cetera?
All right. Samantha, do you agree with that? Because I think what Robert just said is basically Kubernetes comes from corporate and they say, hi, we're here to help you. And the developers kind of shrug and go, well, thanks, we'll get back to you.
Yeah, I guess in kind of how we use Kubernetes at Influx, it is definitely kind of a lot heavier on the ops side of maintaining our cloud products here at Influx. And I think kind of to echo what Robert said, we really want to make sure that our developers want to be writing code versus kind of doing all the nitty-gritty little things that they have to do with Kubernetes. So I think what we try to really emphasize at Influx is utilizing tools. We have like Helm charts, and we have even a telegraph operator that helps us kind of these redundant operational things that engineers, whether developers or ops engineers, have to do kind of repeatedly. Kind of having the tooling around it and making sure, kind of chiming back into open source, making sure that this stuff is open sourced for other people to use as well. So, I think we've kind of seen that kind of the emphasis on the operational side, but I think kind of how we've seen at least people here improve it is trying to automate any tooling and build, I guess, build tooling around it if needed. So yeah, I kind of agree with what Robert has said.
What does that tooling look like? And let me ask the question in this context. So Docker says that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million people using Docker containers to build applications, and that represents roughly a little more than half of all people who build applications in the enterprise. All right, let's just assume that that number is correct for a minute. It would seem to me, Samantha, that a large percentage of those folks are not using app dev tools on Kubernetes to build that. So are they just building stuff off of Kubernetes and then throwing it over the proverbial wall, just like we did in the bad old days? I mean, are my moves so old they're new again kind of motion?
I think based off of my experience and the things I've seen kind of when you aren't kind of using these tools and having to do, like, I think that Docker to Kubernetes percentage that you have, kind of just getting frustrated on doing these things kind of one off and individually, and not when you don't kind of have that automation and tooling in place on large scale environments. If you're doing this kind of on a smaller scope, you might be just like, I'm going to figure out kind of how I can do this one off, however often I need to. So that's kind of maybe what I imagine that I don't know the exact numbers you gave, but that weird Docker to Kubernetes discrepancy that you mentioned.
Robert, any thoughts on that? Or are we just basically, saying yes to the boss and doing something else altogether?
It definitely happens. I think in the cases where we've seen Kubernetes go wrong, that's typically kind of the culture is that the developers just write the code and, they merge it, and then it's up to an ops team to kind of figure out how all that code works, how it needs to run, what kind of memory and CPU it needs to use, what the environment should be like, how it should scale up and down. And the ops team doesn't have all the necessary context they need in terms of how the application behaves. So I think in the best case scenario, dev teams are responsible for some of that configuration. And the way that we've done it internally with our app development team is that for every branch that gets cut for our code, we create an ephemeral feature deployment. So basically like a preview environment where it's actually running in Kubernetes with all of our, as close to production as possible, but with some things kind of factored out, like we have an ephemeral Postgres server to serve as our database and things like that. But that really at least gives us, it forces us as a development team to play with our app inside of a live Kubernetes environment to see how it behaves there. And that's been a huge help in making sure that we catch any bugs that are going to trip up Kubernetes going forward.
All right, well, follow that up for a minute. So despite all these issues that developers are encountering, we're clearly using Kubernetes and there are benefits to be had, including more operational efficiency and all the stuff that the IT ops team enjoys. From your perspective, what is driving Kubernetes adoption? And does that just kind of force the developers down that path because they're part of the organization? And I think I've seen some surveys where I think the primary reason developers were interested is the number one thing checked in the box was career advancement.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do think it's generally an ops-driven initiative. If they want to adopt Kubernetes, it's not typically a developer-driven initiative. Usually, you're trying to solve problems around the scalability of your infrastructure, around really just how your apps, modernizing your application deployment infrastructure, right? Which is typically something that doesn't fall in a typical application developer's plate. It's more falling in that DevOps or ops persona. So I think a lot of developers are, like you said, kind of being forced into that situation by kind of other organizational decisions that are being made. And I think they are realizing that they do need to learn about how their applications are getting into production in order to really stay relevant and be able to operate within their organization.
Samantha, do you think that maybe we just forgot about the app dev side of this equation because the IT ops people drove Kubernetes because of all these efficiencies, but they don't build applications and they just kind of, the whole thing just blew by the developer, and there's an assumption on the IT ops side that somehow or other developers will figure out how to build applications. And maybe there is this moment coming in time where organizations will circle back on this side of the equation?
Yeah, I guess I hope that we're not completely disregarding kind of that the application developer, but I think we've seen we've talked a lot about like scalability. We've seen how operational folks need in order to get what the app developer may be building kind of on a smaller scale, to get that running globally, to get that running, to get it kind of, I don't even know what kind of like cloud usage numbers have, like what that exponential chart may be looking like, but to get that to scale, I think that's kind of where people have been using Kubernetes for however long, and that's kind of just in order to get from that smaller number to scale to production of what a lot of people need. It's kind of just defaulted into Kubernetes. Maybe haven't been able to find any kind of other new technology that maybe people are even familiar with. I think with that kind of like whatever technology transition time that takes, kind of just defaulting to Kubernetes. So I don't think it's necessary disregarding the app developers, but once people have to kind of go into that scalability perspective, they kind of fall into this existing kind of just chain in operation.
Yeah, I do think the nice thing for app developers about Kubernetes versus kind of the days before Kubernetes is that, before, if you wanted to learn at all about how your application is going to go live and scale and, actually serve live traffic, you probably had to learn some proprietary platform like AWS or GCP or Azure, or, maybe something else entirely. So the nice thing about Kubernetes is that the world has started to standardize on a particular, set of APIs for doing these things. And if you learn Kubernetes at a GCP shop, you can transfer most of those skills to an AWS shop, no problem. And so now it's much easier to kind of build your career knowing about Kubernetes instead of doing these kind of very, very learning these sort of piecemeal operations for different cloud providers or different platforms as a service.
To that end, I feel like maybe we're having a bit of a Goldilocks moment here, and let me explain. We have these CASs and PASs, and yet it doesn't seem like people are rushing to adopt all those. So maybe those things are too opinionated for the developers, or they're too much heavy lifting to get into that environment. But at the same time, when you go talk to them about the people who are building applications using things like Docker Desktop, they will tell you that this is a lot of manual work and a lot of movement of shifting of things, and it's difficult and it's not enjoyable per se. It gets, they want to express themselves in code, not necessarily push around a lot of files. So have we just not, Robert, found the right thing yet?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Kubernetes is the right thing if you're at a certain level of complexity, right? If you have a large organization with multiple teams deploying to production, shipping deployments every week, lots of different changes. I think at a certain level of complexity, Kubernetes makes a lot of sense. If you have a simple application that's just, basically a CMS, or, you're serving small amounts of traffic, you only need to run on one machine. You don't really scale up and down or see large bursts in traffic. You probably don't need Kubernetes. You can probably, use Heroku totally fine if you're operating at a certain scale. I think what we're still waiting for is that abstraction layer that allows those simple applications to really take advantage of Kubernetes and grow into a complex ecosystem like Kubernetes without having to learn and deal with all that complexity up front when your application is still simple.
So Samantha, do you agree with that? We're basically an abstraction layer short, because if I go look at everywhere else that people build applications, there are these frameworks, and you work with the frameworks and you probably never see the lower level procedural code anywhere. So is that what we need?
Yeah, I guess that's interesting that you kind of use this Goldilocks metaphor. Like, do we not have this kind of middle ground? And maybe that is kind of the frustration of, as you mentioned, like kind of app developers feeling like they just need to learn Kubernetes to make that leap and have it on their resume to get to that. I don't necessarily know what the goal is. Is it like a chair thing, or is it like bigger pot of porridge or whatever, the bigger chair, like to be able to to get to that bigger step. So yeah, it does like having this like we might be forcing these app developers to kind of to learn and really understand this technology that might be not fully necessary for what they do on a day-to-day basis. Like yeah, if they're not pushing to production X times a day, then they don't need to know about Kubernetes. And what is that middle ground of are they just forcing themselves to do it? And is there something a little less than that they can maybe use better?
I don't know. So let me follow up that thought then. Are we asking too much of developers these days? If I look, in addition to Kubernetes, we want them to figure out how observability platforms work, and then we want to throw a little DevSecOps down that end. And these guys are just trying to figure out how to write code, and we want them to absorb all these tasks that somebody else used to do on their behalf because they might do it better the first time because if they're responsible for it. But that does get in the way of writing code, right? Every minute that I'm managing a platform is a minute that I'm not writing code. So are we asking too much of developers, and have we considered the productivity implications of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Oh, go ahead.
I think it's a great question. It's definitely one I struggle with too. I manage a team of about 9 developers right now, and I do ask each of them to have some level of familiarity with being able to go through, say, our Datadog logs and the stats, and if they launch a feature that maybe causes some memory issues, being able to go in and look at those things. But you're right; it's not what they are trained to do. It's not what they're where their interests lie necessarily. I think it's context that they all need to have, but I'm very lucky that we have also a large team of SREs who can really help us dig into these details. And so I don't feel comfortable really making it their primary responsibility or making the primary person responsible for seeing those things, a developer. I like having a full-time SRE on board to really, take responsibility for those things. But I do think the developers need to at least spend, say 5% of their time and their brain space knowing that these are issues, knowing that, memory usage is a thing and you can't just, have leaky memory in your application, and what that looks like in production when you do have that problem. Because at the end of the day, there is always going to be this gray area between where the application ends and where the infrastructure starts, and the developers kind of need to meet the ops folks halfway there, and that's the whole ethos of DevOps. I think is to help developers kind of start to bridge that gap.
Samantha, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. I guess I was gonna kind of try and say similar type of things. I don't manage kind of any engineers, but I guess. I think at Influx, we want to always make sure that like our app developers have at least like a core baseline of Kubernetes and how that can impact the ops folks or the SRE folks, like how what they're developing and building. I think, yeah, as Robert mentioned, they need to make sure they take into consideration of executing these things in Kubernetes. So making sure, yeah, I think finding that right balance where they're knowledgeable about Kubernetes and how their work will impact and live in it, but leaving the core of the responsibility to the ops and the ops or SRE folks. I think that's probably a fine line and good balance that engineering managers, I guess not me, but other like engineering leadership needs to find. And I think from my experience kind of as a product person and working with these different teams, I think we've managed to do that pretty well, making sure all our developers are somewhat knowledgeable about how we're using Kubernetes and how their work will impact Kubernetes, but leaving kind of the heavy lifting and kind of the expertise to our ops and SRE folks kind of deploying it.
So that sounded a little bit to me like rather than shifting left, we just all kind of need to lean a little bit more left so that we can kind of figure out how to maybe work together and have that little kumbaya moment. Robert, what's your sense of what is the challenge in making that cultural bridge between ops and developers? I mean, we've been on this DevOps thing now for the better part of a decade, and it seems like we're still having these issues. So what's up?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that they're really two different personas, ops and development, right? The way I've seen it work best, and I think leaning left is a great way to put it. But I think the way I've seen it work best is when you have a pure ops team that's responsible for really the underlying infrastructure of making sure Kubernetes stays up to date, all the applications that focus on things like how traffic gets into your cluster, certificate management, DNS, like all those really low level things that no developer ever really has to think about. Having a dedicated ops team for that, but then also having a more DevOps engineer, more co-located with the development team who can focus on, okay, how does the app get into the cluster? How does the app scale up and down? What kind of memory and CPU does it need? So somebody that has a little bit more app context and, basically a person who can serve as that bridge between the pure development team who's just writing code and the pure ops team who's just providing the infrastructure. I think having a person who's meant to serve as that bridge and who has personal relationships with the people on both sides of that fence really can serve as a conduit for the information that needs to cross between the different sides of that wall.
Samantha, how smart will things get in the future? I think part of the problem is if I'm a developer, I'm expected to know the question to ask to go figure out what is the root cause of some issue, and I'm supposed to come up with the queries and the whole 9 yards. And all I really want is like for some platform to show up, and when I sit down, I want an email or even a voicemail or whatever it is that says, here are the 3 things that you're likely to get fired for and you should go fix. So how smart can smart get, and basically just inform the developers that there's a couple of things that you've got in your code base right now that are going to be problematic and you should go fix those 3 things.
Yeah, I imagine things will get, if something doesn't exist like that already, like some person will figure out what. I think we sort of mentioned kind of maybe what like AI capabilities could be implemented in this, but I think what we've focused a lot on is making sure that our app developers are spending time writing code, not troubleshooting kind of these operational problems, and being able to maybe fill in those gaps that they are wasting that they are kind of not spending their time most efficiently on. I imagine that that these things will get smarter and just more efficient too. I think like whatever tools are out there, whatever I think kind of maybe consistently bringing open source back in, whatever open source kind of software there is to do that, kind of how it may need to be adjusted, or kind of any custom code might need to be adjusted to fit a certain person's environment. I imagine kind of the possibilities are going to be coming out at us sooner than later. So.
All right, Robert, I think your mic is out. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
well, what do you think about that? Can AI save us from ourselves here? If I'm a developer, should I spend all this time trying to figure out what observability and security is going to be all about, only to wake up 2 years from now in an entirely different world where I don't have to worry about that stuff because it's all taken care of?
I don't think we're going to wake up in that world anytime soon, to be honest. I am very excited about the potential for AI to help on the development and ops side of things, but there's always going to be some kind of human level, real world context that needs to be taken into account. Like, how important is this application versus this other application? Which one should scale up, and which one should get preference for resources? Which one has more business value? That kind of thing. I think robots can be the thing that machines do really well is kind of repetitive tasks that humans don't really want to do. What they do poorly is take into account all that kind of human level context about relative importance and values and things like that. And I think you're always going to need a human in the loop to help make those decisions. So I don't think there's any reason to just hope that AI is going to come and save us. I think it's important to learn these things today.
All right, let me follow up on that. We would argue that Kubernetes is perhaps the most powerful platform I've seen come down the pike in quite some time, and it has a lot of benefits. It's also the most complex. There's a bit of a trade-off. And we live in this age of conspiracy theories. So let me give you this one. There's a conspiracy theory that says, we're creating all this Kubernetes stuff because it forces organizations to consume it as a managed service. They basically don't have the internal expertise to stand it up. It's hard to train. It's hard to sustain. So maybe the path of least resistance here is to just outsource the management of the platform, either to a cloud service provider or to somebody like you. And is that more costly at the end of the day or less costly? Or do you think, what's the economics of that argument from your perspective?
So I have my own sort of conspiracy theory around Kubernetes that's similar to that, but I think kind of its inverse, which is that I think Google saw AWS kind of eating its lunch in terms of being able to have all these, basically making tons of money serving cloud compute. Right, and I think they created Kubernetes as a sort of open source AWS, as an open open platform for or an open API for basically deciding, declaring how workloads should run in the cloud, how they should communicate with each other, how they should scale up and down, and that made it really easy for if you have Kubernetes to move between cloud providers. And I think that's the really brilliant thing about Kubernetes is that it creates an open abstraction on top of every cloud provider, so that you're not really stuck with one cloud provider. You're not stuck, once you've built a whole bunch of infrastructure and tooling on top of AWS's services, in the bad old days, it would take you, years to transition all that to a new cloud provider. But with Kubernetes, it makes it really easy to move between cloud providers. It is still very, very complex, but I think that complexity just existed as, AWS primitives and GCP primitives before, whereas now it's more of an open thing.
All right, Samantha, as it relates to Kubernetes, at least, do you have any of your own conspiracy theories you want to share, or are you good?
I don't think I have any. I don't think I should have thought of some last night, but
right. No, I don't. We will see. Well, let me ask you this though. To Robert's point, we have these highly distributed computing environments that are starting to emerge. We have APIs everywhere. We're going to have Kubernetes at the edge. We're going to have it in the data center. We're going to have it in the cloud. Are we going to be able to really build those kinds of highly distributed applications? And is that sustainable, or have we reached beyond the capability of the developer community at the moment? And that's going to be a big jump from where we are to this highly distributed computing environment, because those apps are hard to build with, and microservices don't make it any easier.
Yeah, I think kind of focusing on the kind of the distributed aspect of it. I think we kind of would have to kind of just kind of just for things to kind of grow from just a single, like a smaller scale app development to kind of a broader spectrum type of things. I think we will, and just the way kind of we've seen applications growing and developing, like having to do that and finding kind of how to make this easier for the app developer. I think that might be kind of intimidating, kind of you kind of walking through that description. It does seem probably kind of intimidating for any maybe app developers that are on this panel, but being able to do that kind of easier and more efficiently and kind of in a less intimidating manner is something that I think we'll want to be moving towards. I guess maybe is at the shifting left towards. So that's where I could see it going.
All right, more shifting left. Robert, follow up on that. They say Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms. So, and is the next platform that sits on top of that, maybe it could be the database layer for all I know, but there's something that people just write to that masks all the underlying complexity, and maybe I'll never see Kubernetes if I do this right.
Yeah, I mean, I think a platform for building platforms is a great way to describe, I think, the best potential of Kubernetes. I think a lot of organizations will just kind of throw a very vanilla Kubernetes stack at their development teams and say, have at, and that can be a little daunting for those developers. I think the best organizations have a platform development team, that actually takes Kubernetes, under the hood, and then provides some abstractions that make sense for their particular business, the way their teams are set up, the kind of personas that they have in their development teams and ops teams, and they have a platform team that's creating these abstractions. And basically building their own platform on top of Kubernetes. So the development teams don't end up having to know a whole lot about Kubernetes. They provide some kind of YAML file or some other kind of manifest that's specific to that company, and that goes through some, Rube Goldberg machine of, CI/CD, and their application ends up in production. I've only ever seen that work well in a very organizationally specific context. Every time somebody tries to do this in a way that's going to be, applicable across many different types of organizations, they end up hiding some complexity that some organizations need, or it never really quite works out in a way that's organization agnostic. But within particular organizations, I think it works really well.
What do you think, Samantha? Can the database kind of help us out here and provide that layer of abstraction, so long as we have some sort of, to Robert's point, ability to drop out of it to go fix something when it doesn't quite work the way we want it to?
Yeah. I guess that's where kind of the observability, kind of my expertise, kind of the observability and monitoring of these aspects, making sure to kind of automate whatever kind of push to production pipeline your app developers are doing, and knowing, maybe finding where those gaps are, maybe where those are failing, and having to bring in those expertise on the ops side, and being able to implement and improve those changes. But I think having the tools around it, and kind of the entire kind of app platform set up to kind of to operate all of these things, and to get them executed is where you might end up piecemealing things together, but I think we'll create the kind of the most efficient kind of operation.
All right. With any luck, we just write to the APIs and ignore the rest and cross our fingers. Right, here we go.
I guess eventually, but no.
All right, Robert, let me ask you. If I look at what most of the distributions of Kubernetes that are out there, I think there's over 100 of them, but they're basically all based on the version that Google presents or gave, and that was designed for a web scale company. It's huge. Yeah. And my question is, do you think that maybe we're not thinking enough about these lighter weight versions of Kubernetes that people can just run all the way down to their desktop or on a couple of servers, and they don't need all these extra bells and whistles? They just get like Kubernetes core, and maybe that's where we should be going to make it more accessible for developers.
Yes, I think there's two different places that I've seen those other flavors of Kubernetes really come in handy. One is for development environments. So we build an application at Fairwinds that is, serves Kubernetes users. So often we need to stand up lots of little Kubernetes clusters within our development environment, just to test things out, and to have, kind of a lightweight single machine, Kubernetes API, where we can deploy a Helm chart and things like that. And Kind and Minikube have both been very great for us to work with in that particular environment. Another is I've seen a couple cases where it makes sense where folks really want to deploy applications into, like, say, a Raspberry Pi or some very small resource constrained environment, and having a lightweight version of Kubernetes that can run like K3s, that can run without a lot of overhead, I think is super helpful. So I do think there is a place for these kind of lighter distributions of Kubernetes, or these kind of developer-friendly distributions of Kubernetes. But I think by and large, you're going to see most applications that are getting deployed to the cloud getting deployed on like GKE, EKS, AKS, those managed services, or managed Kubernetes frameworks.
Samantha, do you think that presents some management issues? Because if I go back in time, the original thought, at least around Kubernetes, was you were going to create kind of one big giant cluster, and people would share it and they would deploy their apps on that, and you would keep it reasonable to manage. seems like we're back to square one because IT people, especially application owners, as it turns out, were absent that day. We were all taught to share in 5th grade, and they don't like to share. And so now we have all these little Kubernetes clusters everywhere, and now they're going to be out at the edge. And are we prepared for the management challenges that go with that, both from the perspective of a developer who's trying to build to that and an IT operations team that's trying to manage that?
Yeah, I think possibly maybe a little more prepared, just kind of like who's more like a little more prepared from the operational perspective. I think that's kind of where just having that Kubernetes expertise can come in, being able to troubleshoot any problems that come up from kind of this large managed service. The operational folks, that's kind of where you kind of need that balance, right? Is being able to bring in the experts when the time is needed, and being able to have that knowledge share back to those app developers that might have like created this expanded kind of managed kind of environment, and kind of what lessons learned could come from that. But I think that's kind of where that balance of having that expertise on the ops side, but being able to kind of teach kind of lesson learned back to the app developer side can help resolve those problems, or at least kind of figure out how it can work, how you can build whatever application you're doing in the future and have it kind of run seamlessly, maybe work out any bugs or kinks currently in your setup, but resolve those down the line. Is kind of how I see that playing out.
All right. So, Robert, do you think that ultimately will be the dominant model, where there's going to be these fleets of clusters, or do you think there'll be instances where people are still trying to get people to share one massive cluster?
The ideal is definitely the one massive cluster, or at least maybe a few clusters, like a staging cluster and a production cluster. So there is at least some separation from production from your development environments. But what we're seeing is, especially in big enterprises, at least every business unit has its own cluster. Every team has its own cluster. And it does kind of make sense at the end of the day. It is a very clean division of, in terms of security, in terms of reliability and things like that. If you have your own cluster, there's no chance that what something this other team does is going to take down your application. And so I understand why enterprises are going with this giant fleet thing, and I do think it's here to stay, just because it does make such a clean break in terms of security and all that. It is a pain to manage, though, and if you are an ops team who's responsible for making sure that this CVE that just got announced, we're not running any vulnerable versions of Kubernetes, you might have to go in and update, 50 different clusters, 100 different, I've heard of organizations running hundreds of clusters, and having a team that can go in and update the add-ons into those clusters, update the underlying version of Kubernetes, know that they're not going to break anything, have all the context necessary for what's in those clusters. It becomes an operational nightmare. And you really do need something there to help you understand what your risk profile is, where all these clusters live, how to get into them, et cetera.
All right. Well, let's keep on this theme for a little bit. Samantha, I think I'm old enough, at least, to remember, the year of the LAN. It was back in the 80s and 90s, and this was going to be the year for sure that the LAN took off, and that went on for about the better part of a decade. Now, I think I'm on year 3 or 4, depending on how I want to count, of the year of Kubernetes. And I'm now 4 years in. So when do you think that Kubernetes is really going to go mainstream in the enterprise and become a dominant platform? If I talk to people, everybody's got 1 or 2 clusters, but the bulk of what they're running still is legacy monolithic applications. So how long till we get there, as my kids like to say in the back of the car?
I don't know. I kind of think that we're kind of already on that train of getting there from my spends and kind of people that I talk to, and other kind of cloud engineers that I've talked to, like kind of making sure that everyone, I think, I don't know if this brings back to that, like maybe like why people find that they need to have it on, like not just having it on the resume, like there's kind of like a purpose behind it, and the fact that as we're pushing more to the cloud, scaling kind of scaling in the cloud, kind of building that, having more engineers on all levels kind of have not necessarily that expertise, but that knowledge base of Kubernetes. I kind of not sure, kind of just like when and any kind of new, when a developer kind of joins a cloud product out there, I'm sure they're kind of getting entered and having to do kind of have to do this Kubernetes training, or kind of having that background around it. So I think we're definitely moving in this direction where it becomes kind of pretty normalized in these cloud products and apps of having this kind of base knowledge base. So I definitely think we're kind of in that direction. I don't know if this 3 to 4 years, maybe another 3 to 4 years, it will be kind of pretty widespread knowledge. I don't want to give like an exact. We're not betting on time. So,
all right.
But that's what I would say.
Robert, what do you think about that? Because if I look at it in history, at least, I'm hard pressed to name any technology that didn't take 10 years to wind its way through the enterprise. And is that just the nature of the beast?
Yeah, I mean, it's the difficult thing is, like, it's really easy if you were spinning up a new company today, a new application. It's pretty easy to design things in a way where it's like, okay, we're just going to be on Kubernetes. It's going to be all cloud native, everything. But these enterprises have a ton of legacy applications that they're probably just finishing up the containerization of. Maybe haven't even gotten that far. So there are, a lot of applications that were just never designed to be in Kubernetes. They were never designed to be cloud native, and there's a lot of catch up being played right now. Most people that I talk to, have at least accepted that Kubernetes is the way forward. If they're not already there or working there, they know in the back of their head, once I have some time, I want to get there. There's very few people I talk to who say, Kubernetes is just not, it's just a non-starter. We're never going to get there. So I think we're well on our way. As Samantha said, I think we're already like well in the heat of this transition, but there's definitely still a little more work to do.
Well, let me follow up on that with you specifically, but I feel like there's a little bit of this cloud native whitewashing going on, and people are building these, or have taken a monolithic application that sits on a database and chuck the whole thing in a container and call it cloud native. Yep. And then maybe they'll get around to breaking it up later, but is that because there's a business value to doing that, or is it because, it's fashionable and it's a cool thing to do, and I can say that I'm playing with containers?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, you're right. I think, a team gets a top-down directive of, you have to get this into Kubernetes, and so they take their monolith and they, wrap it in a container, and it's a container that uses, huge amounts of memory and CPU, and it's totally not meant for Kubernetes or cloud native. But I do think there is value in doing that. One, because it sets the stage for, okay, we're now on Kubernetes. Any future apps that get created can get moved into this platform and managed in a consistent way with our big monolith. And it sets in some muscle memory around developing around Kubernetes. So I think there's value in it, but you're right. There's a lot of work that needs to be done beyond just wrapping your application in a container and sticking it into a Kubernetes cluster.
All right, Samantha, from the observability perspective, is that progress? Because now I've got a monolithic application, I've got a semi-monolithic application sitting in the containers, and then I got a bunch of microservices hanging around the side of it that I got to manage. And I think, we promised people two things, right? We promised them that there'd be flying cars and that IT would get easier to manage. And I'm not seeing either just yet. So, what's up?
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of based off kind of what the work I do day to day is being able to help kind of organizations, even not as many kind of single developers, but yeah, organizations that have these kind of like broken up systems, and being able to observe and have insight into them kind of as a whole. I think I work with the product I work with, Telegraph. It's the core of it is ingesting data in as many kind of these popular data sources that we need. So I think whether like if you're working on a legacy system as well as kind of a newer Kubernetes model, being able to make sure you have observability into your entire infrastructure and stack is what at InfluxDB we want to make sure that we're able to do for people. So if you're not just looking at your Kubernetes cluster, but this other thing over here is breaking, but being able to make sure you understand and have things as a whole, and maybe help assist that transition. I think kind of our previous topic talking about how long is that transition going to take, being able to still monitor those legacy infrastructures and devices and platforms while slowly transitioning over to maybe your more newer cloud tech products. I think those models kind of are much more common than maybe this new flying car feature we hoped, but and being able to make sure we have those capabilities to hope to maybe get there eventually, but probably not as soon as we hope, but making sure we have the tools to work with what we currently have and suits the best for not only like small middle-sized companies, but these large enterprise businesses.
All right, I think you just said I shouldn't hold my breath for either, but we'll go from here. I've been holding back this question from one of the attendees to now, and I thank you for their patience because I think they asked it about 8 minutes in. But the question is, and Robert, I'm going to throw this your way, is how difficult is it to get to Kubernetes from legacy .NET platforms if you're a developer and you have those kinds of skills and knowledge? And in addition to asking that question, I'd like to just follow that up at the same time with, should I really go after developers who have some legacy background, or am I better off just going out getting developers and training them from the ground up for this brave new world because maybe the other developers are bringing a legacy mindset that might not be helpful? I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, it's always a bit of a struggle to get a legacy application out into Kubernetes, and to get legacy developers into Kubernetes. I think there's a lot of old ways of thinking about things and old ways of doing things that instincts that aren't going to serve you. So it's definitely it's not just like learning a new programming language. I would say it's a total shift in mindset, a shift in a way of thinking about things that those folks need to be able to wrap their heads around. And I think it's going to come up to a person decision whether you want to kind of rewire your brain to think in a Kubernetes way, or if you still want. There's still a large market of enterprises that have not been able to migrate their applications and aren't going to be able to get around to getting their applications migrated, and there's going to be a market for those legacy platform engineers. So I would definitely encourage folks to start leveling up on Kubernetes and thinking about application deployment in the Kubernetes way of things, because I think it's frankly a better way of doing things, and I kind of geek out on it. I think it's just really cool the way things are deployed these days, but it's not an easy lift.
All right. Sometimes you're better off forgetting what you know and just trying to start from the beginning all over again. All right, Samantha, what's your best advice to folks as they kind of struggle with all this stuff and they look at it, and what are your thoughts on where they should get started? And do I need some sort of grand plan, or do I just kind of dive in and hope for the best and get there through the school of hard knocks?
I don't think kind of users and developers out there kind of need a grand plan that exists out there. And I think even just whenever I'm reading about it and trying to understand how our organization is using Kubernetes, I think taking advantage of all the not just like information and I'm just sure like documentation videos that are out there, but just the actual tools that people have built out there that you can hopefully utilize and fits your application or whatever you're building as well. I think that's where I've seen kind of this be kind of the kind of less headachy is what is being able to utilize other tools that are out there and other things that people built, maybe building your own tools if that's kind of what might best suit you for maybe these kind of redundant work. But yeah, to not be intimidated by everything that's out there, knowing that other people are kind of in the same boat and trying to ease this headache and are building other tools around it to make it easier. So I think yeah, not necessarily a grand plan, but just keeping an open mind of if you run into a roadblock to see what else is out there and knowledge share as well. So.
All right, Robert, what do you think? Deep end of the pool and away we go and hope for the best? Or is there some other more elegant way of thinking about it?
I can tell you one of the best things for me as I was ramping up on Kubernetes was to just go to DigitalOcean, spin up a Kubernetes cluster, and start self-hosting a few projects that are kind of pre-built for Kubernetes. There's a Markdown editor out there that I self-host for myself to take notes. Some picture sharing, type applications. And that was just a great way for me to kind of get a sense for, okay, what are the fundamental concepts in Kubernetes? How do applications get deployed? It's a great way to kind of start wrapping your head around all these different concepts and get some real hands-on experience. I can read all day about a new topic and I won't learn a thing. But if I actually get my hands dirty and start doing something, I think that's the best way for me to learn personally.
All right. Next question, Robert, I'm going to ask it to you and then Samantha. So she's going to have the advantage of a minute to think about it more. But so there's a whole community of folks out there and they contribute to Kubernetes and they make all this amazing stuff happen. And there's a lot of innovation. But let's just pretend that you are king of Kubernetes for a day and you could do anything. And it would be the one thing that you would say by fiat, I want to see this available tomorrow to make the lives of developers and IT people easier. What would it be?
Yeah, so I think you touched on this earlier a little bit, but databases and persistent storage are very hard in Kubernetes. It's at the point. I mean, as a company at Fairwinds, we basically tell people don't do it because it's just going to cause headaches. It's going to be a pain. You want to keep your databases and any persistent data out of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is really meant to be an ephemeral place. You should be able to just tear down your cluster, lose everything, and start it back up again. The next day. And it makes it really hard to deploy applications in a very Kubernetes centric way. I still need to deal with a lot of AWS concepts, mainly to interface with RDS and S3. It's all the persistent storage that I have to deal with. I still have to deal with cloud primitives in AWS instead of having this nice open abstraction layer that I can deal with. So that would be my one wish, is if we could get some kind of persistent data into Kubernetes.
All right, but otherwise stateless rules, right?
Yep, exactly.
All right, Samantha, you're queen for the day. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
What are you going to have?
I think maybe just even speaking on how this transition from older legacy system, ideally, if we could, people who are kind of really stuck in these, this is how we've been doing it for X amount of time and kind of can't have that culture shift, how we can develop some magical wand that can transition everything that they do into Kubernetes, or just have people being able to convince people's mind into being able to go into this newer technology, I think would expedite that transition time. I think we've seen with all this technology adoption, and if there's any kind of method of being able to make that transition more seamless, or just kind of more being able to all of a sudden change people's perspectives on it, I think. I don't know. That's kind of my answer to that magic wand question.
All right. And then I would just say that it's almost a given. You're going to have a bad day with Kubernetes and building apps. You're going to have some level of frustration. So when you get to that moment, Robert, what do you think people should do? Walk away, come back, keep going? Do I need a break? Because I think a lot of people get into this and they decide to go build something and then they throw up their hands and then they give up entirely and they go back to what they know. So how do you kind of, on the worst day, keep that momentum going?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a problem I've had throughout my career, whether it's Kubernetes or learning JavaScript for the first time or whatever it is. Personally, I will start just by getting away from the computer for a minute, go for a walk or something, clear my head. But I think the best thing about Kubernetes is that there's a massive community around it. There's a huge Slack where people are very helpful and will happily give feedback. There's a huge ecosystem of partners. If you're like as an organization just stuck, we can't get past this, we don't know how to handle ingress in Kubernetes. There are plenty of folks out there who can operate as consultants and who have seen Kubernetes go wrong 1,000 different ways, who've set it up in a production grade way for hundreds of organizations. You can get help very easily because it's such a big open framework with just a huge ecosystem around it. So look for help. Don't get stuck on your own. Keep asking around. Keep asking other people. Either for free or hire a consultant.
All right. Robert said misery loves company. Samantha, what do you think?
I think definitely there's kind of reaching out to the kind of the community or other experts that are out there. But or just even I think Kubernetes as a whole can kind of just be pretty intimidating in the grand scheme of things, and trying to understand it kind of step by step and coming back to it, breaking it down step by step, and looking at kind of trying to tackle this big mountain kind of 100 feet at a time. I think that's would be kind of the best way to approach it. If like this one, you might just be stuck in this one roadblock, whereas everything else involving it might be a lot more seamless. So I think a combination of those would be the best way to approach it.
You think that people should do this as a hobby before they do much anything else, and just download it onto my laptop and play with it and start building stuff there, so that maybe then I'll get a certification, and then in 6 months to a year, I'm actually ready to take on a job? Or do I wait for somebody? A lot of times I talk to developers and they're like, well, nobody's paying for me to take the training, so I didn't do anything. Should they wait or just keep going? Robert.
That's what worked for me, honestly, was playing with it on my own, finding reasons to use it. Even if they were just kind of toy problems that weren't exactly, problems that operated at Kubernetes scale. I totally recommend playing with it on your own. It's fun. It's a very interesting subject, and I think it'll serve you well in your career, no matter what you end up doing.
All right, and who knows, might lead to your next big raise, right?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Hey, we have 4 winners for our Amazon gift cards today. They are JY, Alan D, Christopher M, Alan J. I want to thank them for attending along with everybody else today. I hope this was helpful. I want to thank our guests today for sharing their knowledge and insights. It was awesome. Samantha, thanks for being on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Mike.
All right. And Robert, thank you for being on. Robert's like going, where'd that hour go, man? That was just could be.
Yeah, thanks a bunch, Mike.
All right, guys. Thank you all for spending some time with us. Everybody have a safe day, and whatever you do, find time to experiment, because that's what's fun. All right. Take care, guys.